Namaste. So I am on vacation this time, so I am pre-recording this rather than doing it live as usual. And I don't have my home altar set up where I do puja and all of that. So doing my best using the online version of the Gita Press translation. So we were in Book 5, Discourse 7, on the story of Bharata. You'll recall that Bharata is the firstborn son of Lord Rishabhadeva, who was an avatar of Vishnu. And Bharata was just made the Maharaja of the region of Jambudvipa, the continent of Jambudvipa, which is soon to be named Bharatavarsha after him, though at the time it has another name. Discourse 7, the story of Bharata. Sri Shuka began again. When Bharata, who was a great devotee of the Lord, was mentally appointed by Lord Rishabhadeva to the rulership of the earth, specifically that kingdom of the earth, he married Panchajani, a daughter of Vishvarupa, intent as he was on obeying the command of the Lord. Even as Ahankara begets the 5 subtle elements, he begot through her 5 sons. Sumati, Rashtrabhrit, Sudarshana, Avarana, and Dhumraketu by name, who were entirely after him, meaning who took entirely after him, who were very much like him. It is from his time that they call this Varsha, known by the name of Ajanabha, as Bharata, or Bharatavarsha. Remaining devoted to his duty like his father and grandfather, the said monarch, who possessed an extensive knowledge and was extremely fond of his subjects, duly protected the people, who adhered each to his prescribed duty. He also worshipped with reverence at the appointed hours the Lord in the form of yajñas and kratus. Yajñas and kratus are both usually called yajñas. The technical distinction is that yajñas are conducted without the yupa, or the sacrificial post, and kratus are those which do have the yupa post. But even today, most yajñas performed, usually both of them are grouped under the title of yajña. Through sacred rites big and small in the form of Agnihotra, Darsha, Purnamasa, Chaturmasya, and Pashusoma of both kinds, those complete in every detail, and those lacking in some particular, undertaken with proper authority and performed with the cooperation of 4 officiating priests, a Hota, an Adharyu, an Udgata, and a Brahma priest. When the various sacrificial performances were duly carried on, with special attention to all supplementary rites, and when the Adharyus took the oblations, the said sacrificer, the Yajamana, Emperor Bharata, mentally offered the reward which was expected from a particular sacrifice in the form of a virtue known by the name of dharma, entirely to Lord Vasudeva, the transcendent reality and the supreme deity, who is not only the soul of sacrifices but their actual doer too, being the ruler of the gods represented by the several mantras symbolic of the different deities. And his passions having been attenuated by his sagacity, he contemplated on the deities enjoying a share in the sacrificial offering as so many limbs of the Supreme Person. When his mind was thus thoroughly purified through the extreme purity of his actions, there arose in his heart loving devotion, which grew exceptionally intense every day, to Lord Vasudeva, the transcendent reality, appearing in the space within his heart, in the form of the Supreme Person Bhagavan Narayana, distinguished by the mark of Srivatsa, the gem known by the name of Kaustubha, a wreath of sylvan flowers, a discus, a mace, and so on, remaining immovable like a portrait in the heart of his devotees and shining brightly in his own mind as the inner controller. Having concluded at the end of 10 million years that the store of merit responsible for his royal fortune must have been exhausted by that time, though his good fortune did not come to an end, but he just figured it was probably time for him to let someone else take over. He proportionately divided among his own sons the hereditary fortune he had been legitimately enjoying, and himself retired as a recluse from his own residence, which was the abode of all prosperity, to the hermitage of the sage Pulaha, situated on the bank of the river Gandaki, and that ashram was named the Shalagrama Kshetra, so called because it, and specifically the river Gandaki that it is next to, abounds in Shalagrama Shilas, or sacred stones symbolic of Lord Vishnu that are found rolling in the bed of the river Gandaki. Impelled by his paternal affection for his own devotees residing in that hermitage, it is said, Lord Srihari reveals himself there in their desired form even today. The holy river Chakranadi, that's the same river as Gandaki, it's also called Gandaka, hallows on all sides the places of this hermitage through contact with circular pebbles, having nave-like marks on both sides. This is a description of the Shalagrama Shilas, or the sacred stones from this river. Duly performing all alone the worship of the Lord through flowers and tender leaves of various kinds, particularly the leaves of the holy basil plant, tulsi leaves, and water, as well as through edibles such as bulbs, roots, and fruits, in a lonely retreat in the grove of the said hermitage, Bharata was rid of all craving for the pleasures of sense, and developing tranquility of mind, derived supreme gratification. His heart melted and benumbed under the pressure of exceptionally increasing love for the Lord, occasioned by incessant worship of the Supreme Person carried on in the aforesaid manner. His hairs stood on their end all over his body as a result of intense delight. His eyes were bedimmed by tears of love proceeding from an ardent longing, and his consciousness being drowned in the deep lake of his heart, brimming over with supreme felicity flowing from devotion, which was enriched by constant thought of the feet of his beloved Lord, red as a lotus. This refers to the bottom of the feet. It is consistent in the Shastras that the feet of Narayana or of Krishna, that the undersides are reddish pink, as are the palms of his hands, while the rest of his body is blue. He forgot even the worship that was being done by him, as aforesaid. Having thus undertaken vows of propitiating the Lord and looking very bright in his covering of deer skin and with his head of tawny, curly, and matted hair wet through ablutions performed thrice every day, he waited upon the all-effulgent Lord Narayana, the Supreme Person, as manifested in the orb of the rising sun, with hymns addressed to the sun god, and prayed as follows. The light of the sun god, which lies beyond the material plane, dispenses the fruit of our actions. It is the same light which evolved this universe by its mere thought, and again protects the jiva, seeking its protection with its power of consciousness. We resort to that light which propels our intellect. Thus ends the seventh discourse, forming part of the story of Emperor Bharata, dealing with the worship of the Lord, in Book 5 of the great and glorious Bhagavata Purana, otherwise known as the Paramahansa Samhita. Discourse 8. Bharata conceives an infatuation for a fawn and is reborn as a deer. Sri Shuka continued. Having bathed in the great river Gandaki, and having finished his routine of religious duties, as well as other unavoidable duties, one day Bharata squatted on the bank of the river for 3 muhurtas, repeating the sacred syllable Om. So that's for nearly 2.5 hours straight. Meanwhile, on that spot, O king, a deer approached the riverbank all alone to drink water. While it was yet avidly drinking water, there arose a loud, deep, and hoarse sound, striking terror into the heart of all, of a lion roaring not very far from that place. Hearing that sound, that deer, which was shy by its very nature, and looked with bewildered eyes, felt all the more perturbed at heart, overcome as it was with the fear of the lion, and precipitously leapt across the stream, its eyes swimming, as in like rolling with fear, and its thirst not yet quenched. Even as the deer, which was big with young, meaning pregnant, took the leap, the fetus that had been dislodged through excessive fear came out of the vagina and fell into the stream. Afflicted with exhaustion caused by the premature delivery and the leap, as well as with fear, and having strayed from its troop, The female deer then dropped down in some cavern and died. Moved with compassion at the sight of the helpless young deer, the newborn and prematurely born fawn, forsaken and being swept away by the current, the Raja Rishi Bharata picked it up and took it to the hermitage, like a friend, knowing it to be motherless. As Bharata intensely thought of the young deer as his own, and conceived an attachment for it by nourishing it, protecting it, caressing it, and humoring it, by scratching and stroking its body every day, all his routine duties, including practices of self-restraint as well as his devotional duties, such as the worship of the Lord, came to be neglected one by one, and were actually abandoned in the course of a few days. Oh, torn from its class as well as from its near and dear ones, and alas, brought under my protection by the fast-rotating Kala Chakra, the wheel of time, this helpless young deer has accepted me alone for its parents, kith and kin and mates, knowing no one else, and has great confidence in me. Hence it behooves me to nourish, protect, gratify, and fondle, in an uncavilling spirit, this fawn exclusively depending on me, knowing as I do that it is sinful to forsake him who seeks my protection. Surely, worthy and pious souls who are given to self-control and are friends of the poor ignore their own big interests for the sake of such creatures. Having thus developed an attachment for it, Bharata's heart remained knit with bonds of love to that young deer, even while he sat, lay asleep, sauntered, remained standing, ate his food, and on other such occasions. When he thought of fetching kusha grass, flowers, sticks for the sacrificial fire, leaves, fruits, roots, or water, he repaired to the woods along with the young deer, apprehending danger from wolves and dogs and other animals if he left it alone. When due to its innocence it got stuck up at some place on the wayside, like it jumped up onto a rock or something and couldn't get down, he picked it up and bore it on his shoulder out of tenderness, with a heart full of great affection, and holding it thus on his lap and bosom, experienced supreme felicity in fondling it. Even while performing ritual acts, the emperor would rise at frequent intervals to attend to the deer. Perhaps it was wandering off or something, or at risk of falling in the river. And when he had seen it, he pronounced his benedictions on it with a reassured mind, saying, "May you be safe on all sides, my darling." At other times, if he didn't see where the deer was, he would feel extremely perturbed, like a miser who had lost his fortune, and sorrowing for it alone with a heart full of agony and overwhelmed with grief at his separation from that young deer, and actually infatuated by an inordinate longing to see it, pitifully exclaimed, it is said, as follows: "Oh, will that poor young deer, the offspring of a deceased mother, return, reposing confidence by virtue of its own credulity in me, a wicked and unlucky soul, deceitful as a cheat and hard-hearted like a hunter," he's saying in a self-deprecating way of himself, "and overlooking like a saint my wicked nature. Shall I see it grazing in safety tender blades of grass in the grove of this hermitage, protected by Providence? May it not be that a wolf or a dog or any other beast roaming all alone or going about in herds will devour it? Lo, the Lord who has the 3 Vedas for his body and who rises for the welfare of the whole world is going down," meaning the sun. "But the pledge of the doe is not yet returning to me." The pledge of the doe being a poetic way of referring to the fawn. "Will that prince of a deer come back and delight me, an unlucky soul relieving the sorrow of its kith and kin by its manifold, delightful, and charming fawn-like sports? When I closed my eyes in jest, putting up a false show of meditation, it would approach me greatly agitated and feeling indignant through love, would strike me with the end of its horns, soft as a drop of water. When on the kusha grass, with the offering for the sacred fire placed on it, being polluted by the deer, it was scolded by me. It got much frightened and instantly abandoned its playfulness, would sit like a young hermit with all its senses fully controlled. Oh, what austerities have been performed by this fortunate earth, who by the series of impressions imprinted by the feet of that docile young of a black antelope, with their tiny, lovely, most propitious and soft hoofs, not only reveals the tracks of my fortune to my wretched self, robbed of his wealth and therefore miserable, but at the same time adorns her own person, the earth, on all sides, and turns it into a sacrificial ground for the twice-born seeking after heaven, or final beatitude. This is in reference to a verse in the Shastras that the sanctity of a tract of land inhabited by the black antelope is There's a line, I've come across this in the Manu Smriti, and I think it's in some of the other Dharma Shastra literature as well, that says that it praises the specific sanctity of the region of land that is the habitat of the wild black antelope, kind of referring to a large swath of India mainly. So that's what he was referencing there. Observing the dark spot in the moon and imagining it to look like a deer, he said, he thinks to himself, may it be that the glorious moon god, who is kind to the afflicted, is protecting that young deer, whose mother died from fear of a lion, and that has strayed from its abode. Or is it that he is soothing by the cool and placid slobber in the form of nectarian rays flowing copiously from his mouth through love, me, the lotus of whose heart has been burning with the flames of wildfire in the form of agony caused by separation from my pet, and who had followed that young of a deer. Troubled at heart with such fantastic ideas, Bharata was diverted from the practices leading to union, as well as from practices in the form of worship of the Lord, by his own destiny appearing in the form of that young antelope. Otherwise, how could there appear attachment for the young of a deer that belonged to a different species, and one who had already left his own sons, so difficult to part with, as a direct impediment to his attaining final moksha? While the Raja Rishi Bharata was lost in self-oblivion, the practice of yoga commenced by him having thus been interrupted, and his mind engrossed in the thought of nourishing, protecting, humoring, and caressing the young deer, the hour of death, which is difficult to overpass and which approaches with terrible speed, arrived, even as a serpent would run up to the hope of a rat. Continuing even at that time to look intently on the deer that was lamenting by his side like a real son, since evidently the deer is aware that he's dying or at least not doing well. With his thought fixed on that animal alone, Bharata, on quitting that body, simultaneously with the deer, attained the body of a deer, as any other mortal would do under the same conditions, since the focus on the deer was deeply pervading his consciousness at the time of death, which will indeed almost always cause rebirth as a deer. Of course, the memory of his previous life did not leave him, as did the dead body, since he was such a highly accomplished yogi. Recollecting by virtue of the sustained endeavors to propitiate the Lord, even in that incarnation the cause of his being reborn as a deer, and repenting bitterly, he said to himself, "Oh, how painful it is that I have strayed from the path trodden by the self-poised, in that, even though I had completely shaken off all attachments, and strong-willed as I was, had retired to a lonely and holy forest, my mind, which had been wholly devoted to and thoroughly concentrated in Lord Vasudeva, the self of all selves, in course of time, every hour of which was utilized through diligent application to sacred pursuits, such as constantly listening to, fixing one's mind on, and duly chanting his names and praises, worshipping him, and incessantly thinking of him, slipped in no time after the young of a deer, a fool that I was." With this feeling of remorse fully disguised, Bharata, now a deer, forsook his mother, the doe, and returned from the mountain of Kalanjara, his birthplace, to the hermitage of the sage Pulastya and Pulaha, also known by the name of Shalagrama Kshetra, a site consecrated to the Lord and a favorite resort of hermits naturally given to self-control. So the same ashram where he died in his human body. Awaiting his death and terribly afraid of attachment, since he's aware of what it got him into this time, he lived there too, all by himself, subsisting on dry leaves, blades of grass, and low shrubs, and looking forward to the exhaustion of the stock of karma responsible for his birth as a deer. And eventually, when the hour of death arrived, he cast off his bestial form, a part of which had been laid under the water of the holy river Gandaki. So he died lying down, partly in the water and partly out. Thus ends the 8th discourse, forming part of the story of Bharata in Book 5 of the great and glorious Bhagavata Purana, otherwise known as the Paramahansa Samhita. There's a footnote here saying that death with half of one's body immersed in the water of a holy river or lake or the ocean is believed to confer great religious merit on the dying soul, and this posture, has been referred to in the Shastras under the name of Ardhajala, literally just half in water. The great Bharata was evidently put in mind of this purificatory process while casting off the form of a deer, so that's why he assumed that position to die. Discourse 9, Bharata reborn for a second time in a Brahmana family. Sri Shuka resumed. Now from the loins of a certain holy Brahmana, the foremost in the line of the sage Angira, who is one of the mind-born sons of Brahma, one of the Prajapatis, who had controlled his mind and senses, was rich in asceticism and the study of the Vedas, liberality, endurance, modesty, the knowledge of rituals, freedom from jealousy, knowledge of the spirit, and felicity, were born through the same mother 9 sons, like himself in learning, good character, purity of conduct, comeliness of form, generosity, and other virtues, and a son and a daughter born as twins through a younger wife. Of these twins, the male child was, they say, that supreme devotee of the Lord, the foremost of Raja Rishis, Bharata, who having shed his bestial form, had in that last incarnation attained the state of a Brahmana. Apprehending his fall through attachment to his people in that incarnation too, and terribly afraid of such attachment, remembering as he did by the grace of the Lord a series of his previous incarnations, he showed himself to the world as an insane, stupid, blind, and deaf fellow, trying to prevent anyone from forming a relationship with him, clasping firmly with his mind the Lord's lotus feet that break asunder the fetters of karma in the case of those who hear of those feet, think of them, or utter their praises. The Brahmana, whose heart was knit with affection to the child, actually performed all the sanskaras up to the ceremony of Samavartana, which is the ceremony of returning from the house of the Guru after finishing one's study of the Vedas, according to precept, even with respect to such a son, indeed, who appears to be deaf and blind and extremely mentally handicapped. And on the boy being invested with the sacred thread, he further instructed him well in the method of personal purity, rinsing his mouth, and other rules of conduct, even though they were not liked by the boy, believing as he did that a son must be instructed in the rules by his father, regardless of the circumstances. The child, however, did everything topsy-turvy, as it were, in the very presence of his father, with the result that the Brahmana, who wanted to start instructing him in the Vedas as soon as the rains set in, when the child had reached the appropriate year, was able to teach the boy the 3-footed Gayatri mantra, along with the Vyahritis, which are the syllables Bhu, Bhuva, and Swaha, and the sacred syllable Om, the crown of the Vedic texts, only in a disjointed fashion, without proper intonation, although he learnt it continuously all the 4 months of spring and summer. Having thus fondly given his heart to his son, who was his very self, he taught him personal purity, the recitation of the Vedas, austerities, self-discipline, service to the Guru, and offering worship to the fire and other duties of a religious student, observing celibacy for a limited period only, even though they were all neglected by the boy, clinging to the ill-conceived notion that a son must be taught these things under all circumstances. But before his ambition could be realized, the Brahmana, who was himself steeped in error, was snatched away by the ever-vigilant death at his very home. Thereupon the younger of the 2 wives of the Brahmana entrusted her twin-born children to her co-wife, and herself attained to the realm where her husband had gone, by dying after him. On the father's death, the brothers, who were ignorant of his greatness, and who had concluded the knowledge of the 3 Vedas to be the highest knowledge, and attached no importance to the knowledge of the self. Of course, the knowledge of the self is in the 3 Vedas, but in this case we mean the karma kanda, the rituals of the Vedas, the Vedic Samhitas, and not the deeper portions of the Vedas. They decided to give up their insistence on teaching their brother, taking him to be a dunce. As for Bharata, when he was addressed as a lunatic, a dullard, or a deaf fellow by the common people, the 2-footed brutes, a way of referring to the common people, He spoke words befitting such a description, and would do work as desired by others when compelled to do so. He would eat any food got through forced labor or by way of remuneration, by begging or without asking, no matter whether it was scanty or plentiful, tasteful or bad, but never for the gratification of his senses. For having realized his oneness with the all-blissful self, that is, of the nature of absolute consciousness, ever without cause and shining by itself, he never identified himself with the body, in joy or sorrow occasioned by pairs of opposites. He roamed about like a bull, bare-bodied alike in heat and cold, as well as in storm and rain, yet stout and muscular, with his spiritual glory concealed under dirt that he had put on by lying down to sleep on the ground, and because of his never rubbing or washing his body, even like a precious jewel encrusted in earth, his loins covered by a dirty rag, and a still dirtier sacred thread on his person, and slighted by men who were ignorant of his worth, by being contemptuously called a Dvija, the son of a Brahmana, in name only, and so on. That they're calling him the son of a Brahmana, but implying that he himself is not a Brahmana. When, however, he was seen seeking his morsel of food from others through work done on wage, which is Shudra Dharma, and was set to work at the field even by his brothers, he did the same. But he never cared to know whether the ground was level or uneven, and whether he did more or less than what was required of him, and ate as ambrosia even broken rice, oil cakes, husk, worm-eaten grains, and the charred remains of boiled rice, etc., sticking to the bottom of a cooking pot, and other such things. Now, on a certain occasion, a chieftain of the Shudras, desirous of an issue, meaning a child, proceeded to behead a human victim to goddess Bhadrakali. Pursuing at dead of night the tracks of the man intended to be sacrificed, who had providentially escaped, the servants of that chieftain were unable to find him out in that dark night, and by chance saw Bharata busy guarding the fields against deer, boars, etc., from a shed overlooking the fields. Finding him faultless in every limb, and feeling assured that the purpose of their master would be accomplished, since he is fit for their human sacrifice, they bound the sage with a rope and took him to the shrine of goddess Chandika, their faces blooming with joy. Then the burglars washed him according to their own traditional usage, provided him with a new piece of cloth, and graced him with jewels, sandal paste, a wreath of flowers, a sacred mark on the forehead, and so on. And when he had had his meal, they seated the human victim in front of goddess Bhadrakali, in front of their murti of the goddess Bhadrakali, according to the standard rules of animal sacrifice, offering incense, light, a wreath of flowers, parched grains of paddy, young leaves, sprouts, fruits, and sweets, etc., and loudly singing songs and hymns and sounding clay and wooden tom-toms. Then the thief, officiating as a priest to the chieftain of the Shudras, took up a most fearful and sharp-edged sword that had been consecrated by pronouncing on it a mantra sacred to goddess Bhadrakali, with a view to sating her with the inebriating blood of a human victim. Perceiving the immolation, not permitted even when falling in the category of a slaughter permissible in the face of imminent danger to life, of the son of a Brahmana sage who had actually become one with the infinite, and who not only bore enmity to none, but was friendly to all living beings, a most horrible act on the part of those Shudras, in whom the qualities of Rajas and Tamas naturally predominated, nay, whose mind had been puffed up with the pride of wealth, which taints one's souls, and who willfully trod the evil path, disregarding the Brahmanas, who represent a ray of the Lord, and delighting in acts of violence. The same goddess Bhadrakali suddenly emerged from her image, her body severely burning with the spiritual glow of the Brahmana, most difficult to bear. With her arched eyebrows thrown up in vehemence of extreme indignation and intensity of rage, curved teeth and wild bloodshot eyes, she assumed a most dreadful aspect, as if intending to destroy the world, laughed a terrible horse laugh in great anger, and springing up from the altar and lopping off the heads of those wicked sinners with the same sword, their own consecrated sacrificial sword, drank to satiety along with her retinue, the exceedingly hot and inebriating blood streaming forth from their necks. Then, overpowered with intoxication through excessive drink of fresh human blood, She sang at the pitch of her voice along with her attendants, and also danced and played with the heads like balls. Even so, indeed, does an act of transgression against exalted souls in the form of an attempt to kill them recoil in its entirety upon the offender himself. Nor is this any great wonder, O Vishnudatta, which is a name of Parikshit, that perfect equanimity should reign even on the eve of being beheaded, in the mind of sages who are at the same time devoted to the Lord, who have succeeded in resolving the exceptionally hard knot existing in their heart in the form of self-identification with the body, mind, and senses, etc., who are friends, nay, the very self of all living beings, who bear enmity to none, and who are protected on all sides by the vigilant Lord himself, with the help of his equally vigilant weapon, the great Sudarshana Chakra, and through various forms, such as that of goddess Bhadrakali, inasmuch as they have resorted to the soles of his feet, where there is no fear from any quarter. Thus ends the 9th discourse, forming part of the story of Jadabharata, or the births of Bharata, and Book 5 of the great and glorious Bhagavata Purana, otherwise known as the Paramahansa Samhita. Discourse 10, the meeting of Jadabharata with King Rahugana. Sri Shuka began again. A king of the principalities of Sindhu and Sauvira, Rahugana by name, was going in a palanquin to meet the divine sage Kapila to receive instruction in spiritual knowledge, as we read about earlier, much earlier, when we were hearing about the incarnation of Kapila avatar. While looking on the bank of the Ikshumati river for a man to serve as the bearer of his palanquin, the mate of the bearers came across this eminent Brahmana as prearranged by Providence. On the ground that he was stout, young, and muscular, and fit to carry a load like an ox or a donkey, he was caught hold of by force along with those already employed to work without any wage, and that highly dignified soul bore the palanquin, even though he did not deserve such humiliation. When the gait of the men bearing the palanquin did not fall in line with that of the holy Brahmana, who stepped forward only after surveying the ground up to a distance of 3 feet, so he will carefully look where he's stepping before stepping forward. This is the practice that Jain monks often still do to make sure that he's not going to harm any creature by accidentally stepping on it. And so he's not keeping up with the other palanquin bearers who are walking faster. King Rahugana, on finding his palanquin irregularly borne, said to the bearers, "O bearers, march properly. Why is the palanquin borne irregularly in this way?" Now, on hearing the reproachful words of their master, and afraid at heart of punishment, they submitted to him. "We are not remiss, O ruler of men. Obeying your commands, we bear the palanquin quite well. Though engaged just now, this new man does not walk quickly. We are therefore unable to bear the palanquin with him." Hearing their piteous words, King Rahugana concluded that the fault appearing in one through contact is sure to become the fault of all who are connected with that person. Even though he had sat at the feet of sages, his kshatriya spirit prevailed over him. His judgment having been clouded by the element of rajas, he felt a bit enraged, and spoke ironically to that Brahmana, whose spiritual glory was not distinctly perceived, like fire covered with ashes. "What a pity, brother! You are evidently very tired. You have borne the palanquin single-handed all this long way, for long hours, and none of these other associates, O friend, have shared your burden. You are neither very stout nor possessed of an adamantine frame, and are oppressed with old age, too." Even when taunted unsparingly in this way, the sage, who had become one with the infinite and never entertained the false notion of I or mine with regard to his ultimate body, which was nothing but a concatenation of various limbs put together in a particular disposition, consisting as it did of the 5 gross elements, the indriyas, the past actions, and the mind, evolved by ignorance and unreal, quietly bore the palanquin as before. King Rahugana, however, flew into a rage at his palanquin being borne irregularly again, and said, "Oh, what does this mean? Though living, you are as good as dead, in that you ignore me and transgress the commands of your lord. I shall accordingly correct you, perverse as you are, even as Yama chastises the people so that you may recover your senses." To Rahugana, who had in his pride mixed with anger and infatuation, slighted all the devotees of the Lord, and thought himself to be a wise man, although he was not much acquainted with the ways of masters of yoga, and was at the same time talking much nonsense, accounting himself to be a ruler of men, that worshipful Brahmana, who had become one with the infinite Brahman and was a friend, nay, the very self of all living beings, smilingly spoke as follows, even though he was altogether free from pride. The Brahmana said, "What has been hinted at by you is evidently true and constitutes no reproach. It would be a slur if this burden borne on its bearer, O valiant king, had rested on me, and if the goal to be reached or the way, existing in the eyes of the goer, had reference to me." Here he is speaking from the perspective of the Paramatman, saying that the burden borne on its bearer, meaning the body, had rested on me, the incorporeal spirit, who has no burden at all. And if the goal to be reached or the way, existing in the eyes of the goer, the living being in a body, had reference to me, the all-pervading and immovable spirit. The epithet stout, he says, is used by the wise with reference to a body alone, and never in relation to the incorporeal spirit. Stoutness and leanness, ailments and worries, hunger and thirst, fear and strife, desire and old age, sleep and attachment to the pleasures of sense, anger and vanity arising from egotism, and grief, appear in one who is born with a feeling of identification with the body, and not in me. Death, synchronous with life, O king, is as a rule perceived in everything which undergoes transformation. For whatever undergoes transformation has a beginning and an end, and orders should be given by one and carried out by another without fail, only where the relation of servant and master is fixed, O praiseworthy monarch. And we do not find the slightest occasion for the notion of difference, apart from usage or convention, between a master or a servant. Under such circumstances, who is the ruler and who the servant? Nevertheless, O king, what can we do for you? And what object will be gained by you, O valiant monarch, by correcting me or teaching a lesson to me who behave like a lunatic, a sot, or a dunce, even though established in my own self? And if I am stupid or drunk, giving a lesson to me will be as unprofitable and preposterous as grinding flour. Sri Shuka continued, having made this brief reply in the form of a bare statement of facts, the Maharshi Bharata, who was tranquil by nature and in whom the cause for identification with the body had ceased, bore the palanquin even as before, in order to exhaust the stock of karma which had already begun to bear fruit, by reaping its consequences. On hearing the reply of the Brahmana, who is capable of resolving the knot existing in one's heart, and was borne out by many a work on self-knowledge, the said ruler of the territories of Sindhu and Sauvira, too, who had by virtue of genuine faith acquired the qualification for inquiring into the truth, quickly alighted, climbed down from the palanquin, realizing the profound meaning of what this man had been saying, and asking forgiveness, and approaching the soles of his feet with his head, spoke, completely rid of his pride of sovereignty. Who are you that go about incognito and wear the sacred thread of the twice-born? If you are an avadhuta, which is one who has shaken off all worldly feelings and obligations, which one may you be? He's thinking he may be a well-known one, who he may have heard of. Whose son are you, and born at what place? And wherefore are you here? If you have come here for our good, are you not the sage Kapila? I fear neither the thunderbolt of Indra, nor the trident of Lord Shiva, the three-eyed, nor the rod of Yama, nor the weapons of the fire god, the sun god, the moon god, the wind god, and Kubera, but I am terribly afraid of showing disrespect to the Brahmanas. Tell me this, roaming about as you do like a dunce, with your greatness in the shape of profound wisdom fully disguised, free from attachment and possessing infinite glory. Your words, which are replete with self-knowledge, O pious sage, cannot be penetrated even with the help of intuition. Moreover, I was proceeding to ask Lord Kapila, who is no other than Sri Hari, descended with a view to imparting knowledge, nay, who is the master of yoga and the supreme guru of sages knowing the truth about the self. What is the asylum in this world? May it be that you are the same Lord Kapila going about incognito in order to examine the condition of the world? How can he who is tied to his home and whose intellect is blinded understand the ways of masters of yoga? I have known weariness being felt by me through activity, and infer that the same must be experienced by you while bearing a load and walking. The phenomenal world, too, ought to have a reality at its bottom, for otherwise it will have no utility, nor will it be possible to take any work from it, any more than one can fetch water and so on in an unreal jar. In consequence of a kettle being heated by fire, the water also gets fully heated, and due to the heat of the water, the grains of rice in the water get softened, first externally and then their interior too, and the heat thus conducted from the pot to the water and from the water to the exterior of the grains in the first instance and later on to their interior as well, is clearly not unreal. Even so, due to contact with the body, as well as with the indriyas and the mind, their experiences are transmitted to the soul because of its taking upon itself the attributes of its conditioning vestures, just as the interior of the rice slowly changes by taking on the attributes of the mind, the indriyas, the senses, the body that it wears. A king is the ruler and protector of the people. He who is a servant does not grind what is already ground, meaning undertake an unprofitable business. For by offering worship to the Lord in the shape of performing his duty, he is able to get rid of his stock of sins. Therefore may you be pleased, O friend of the afflicted, to cast a kindly look on me, who have slighted the most holy, through vanity arising from consciousness of my being a ruler of men, so that I may get rid of the sin incurred by showing disrespect to pious souls. Although there is no agitation in you, who are a friend and a well-wisher of the universe and have entirely ceased to identify yourself with the body because of your undifferentiating outlook, a man like me is sure to perish at no distant date, as a result of his own misdeed in the shape of despising exalted souls, even if he were Lord Shiva himself. Thus ends the 10th discourse in Book 5 of the great and glorious Bhagavata Purana, otherwise known as the Paramahansa Samhita. Discourse 11. Bharata's teaching to King Rahugana. The Brahmana, Bharata, replied, Though ignorant, you make speeches like the rejoinders of learned men. Hence you are in no way the best among those who are exceptionally wise. For the knowers of truth never discuss these mundane relations along with an inquiry into the reality. Even so, O king, in the Vedic texts glorifying heavenly enjoyments and the means of attaining them, extensively figuring in the branch of knowledge, and elaborating the numerous rituals connected with household life, he's referring here to the kalpa portion of the Shastras, especially. An exposition of truth containing no suggestion in favor of injury to life and free from partiality and prejudice does not, as a matter of fact, generally appear. Even the utterances which are the most sacred have not proved adequate to reveal the truth directly to him by whom the bliss resulting from sacrificial acts pertaining to a household life is not spontaneously concluded to be worth throwing away on the analogy of a dream. So in other words, there is no scripture, no matter how perfect, can instantly grant acceptance and understanding to someone who still holds on to attachments. It takes an inner experience and not any kind of reading or hearing any particular intellectual teaching. So long as the mind of a man is dominated by sattva, rajas, or tamas, it continues unchecked to yield him virtue or sin through his senses of perception and his organs of action. This mind is a storehouse of impressions, is attached to the pleasures of sense, tossed about by the three gunas, and hence liable to disturbances in the form of lust, anger, and so on. It is the foremost among the 16 constituents of the subtle body, and, clothing itself with diverse forms under different names, makes for a higher or lower form of life. Embracing the embodied soul connected with it, the mind, which is an adjunct of the soul, brought forth by Maya, and which unveils the soul into the whirlpool of birth and death, yields at the proper time pleasure and pain, and the other inevitable fruit different from both. Meaning insensiteness, the obscure consciousness, such as in deep sleep or so on, when neither pleasure nor pain are experienced. It is only till then, meaning so long as the mind exists, it is only so long as the mind exists that these phenomena of the waking and dream states ever shine forth and continue to be perceived by the knowing subject. It is therefore that the knowers of truth declare the mind to be the cause of the degraded state of mundane life, as well as of the highest state of liberation. A mind attached to the pleasures of sense leads to misery, while that which is free from their influence makes for moksha. Even as a light, so long as it consumes a wick soaked in ghee, emits a flame crowned with soot, while at other times it returns to its original state, so does a mind attached to the objects of sense as well as to actions flow in various currents, whereas it returns to its essence when it is no longer attached to them. The 5 organs of action, the 5 senses of perception, and the ego sense. These are the 11 currents through which the mind substance flows. And the wise declare the 5 forms of organic activity, the 5 subtle elements, and the body as the 11 receptacles into which these 11 currents flow, O valiant king. Smell, color, touch, taste, and sound are the objects of the senses of perception. Defecation, coition, locomotion, speech, and grasping or releasing an object. These are the functions of the organs of action. Obviously, these are symbols for broader categories of elimination, sexual activity, moving about, communicating, and interacting with physical objects. And acknowledging the body as mine, which is the 11th, is the function of the ego sense, the sense that your body is yours. That it is the word your in the idea your body. Others declare awareness of the body as one's own self as the 12th current of the mind, distinguishing between the body as mine and the body is me. So some philosophers merge those two into one category, and some split them into 2 separate categories. And they speak of the body as the 12th object, those who split those two into 2, the identification with the body as your possession or your body as yourself. Due to the endless variety of objects, as well as to the very nature of things, and to the diversity of predispositions and karmas, and the action of time, these 11 modifications, or 12, of the mind are multiplied into hundreds, thousands, and tens of millions, since they all interact with each other in tens of millions of possible different configurations. They proceed from God and have no existence of their own, nor do they owe their existence to one another. God, who is pure, merely looks on these waves appearing in an endless series, now manifesting and now disappearing, of the mind, which is an adjunct of the jiva and a creation of Maya, and which indulges in impure activities, while God, remaining pure, simply observes them. God is all-pervading, the most ancient, all-perfect, patient, self-effulgent, free from birth, the ruler of the highest beings, the almighty Lord Vasudeva, the abode of the universe, dwelling as the controller of all the jivas in every heart by his own Maya. Even as the air, entering in the form of breath into all mobile and immobile beings, controls them. By controls them meaning they depend on it. They will die almost immediately without it. So the Supreme Lord Vasudeva has interpenetrated this universe as the all-witnessing inner controller. An embodied soul continues to revolve in mundane existence so long as it is not able, O ruler of men, to realize the true nature of the self by shaking off this Maya by means of the light of wisdom, having got rid of attachment and conquered the 6 enemies, the 6 enemies being lust, anger, greed, infatuation, arrogance, and jealousy. And so long as he is not able to recognize the said mind, a conditioning vesture of the soul which brings with it an uninterrupted succession of grief, infatuation, disease, attachment, greed, and animosity, and occasions a feeling of mineness, as a fertile soil yielding the agonies of birth and death for man. Therefore, circumspect and armed with the worship of the feet of Lord Sri Hari in the form of your Guru, get rid of this enemy that possesses enormous strength and has grown very insolent through connivance, and which, though illusory in itself, yet robs you of your very self. Thus ends the 11th discourse, forming part of the dialogue between the Brahmana and King Rahugana, in Book 5 of the great and glorious Bhagavata Purana, otherwise known as the Paramahansa Samhita. Discourse 12. Bharata answers the query of Rahugana. Rahugana said, "Hail, hail to you, who have taken this godlike form and have ignored your body in self-realization. Hail to you, O master of yoga, who have concealed your realization of eternal truth under the garb of an unworthy Brahmana, a Brahmana in name only. Like a palatable medicine to one suffering from the disease of fever, or like cold water to one scorched by heat, your word, O holy Brahmana, has proved a nectar-like remedy to me, whose vision has been bitten by the serpent of self-identification with this worthless body. I shall therefore refer my doubt to you later. Explain to me at present, inquisitive as I am, your teaching, which is pregnant with deep spiritual import, in such a way as to make it easily intelligible. My mind is bewildered by the statement you have made, O Master of Yoga, that actions and their visible effects, though not illusory, are relative and cannot easily stand a sitting inquiry into the truth." The Brahmana replied, "That which is a modification of earth, traversing its surface for some reason, O king, comes to be known as this man," gesturing to one of the palanquin bearers. "And above the feet of this are located the two ankles, the two shanks, the two knees, and the two thighs, the waist, the chest, the neck, and the two shoulders. On one of the shoulders lies the wooden palanquin, in which is seated another modification of earth, bearing the title of Sauvira Raja, the king of Sauvira. Having identified yourself with this, you account yourself as the ruler of the Sindhus, blinded by vain pride. Nay, constraining these people, who were already afflicted with great misery, and deserved to be pitied, to do work for you without any remuneration, you are proving your heartlessness. Shamelessly bragging that you are a guardian of the people, you cut a sorry figure in the assemblies of the wise. When we know that the mobile and immobile creation invariably springs up from earth and is reabsorbed into the earth, tell me if there is any ground for activities, other than names, that may be concluded to be real by virtue of the work that we take from it, since it's all temporary. Whatever harvest you glean from the earth, you will die, and everything that you ever gained from it will be lost," is the point he's making there. What is denoted by the word earth is similarly explained because of its being resolved into the finest atoms, its constituent factors. As for the atoms, by whose concatenation the element known by the name of earth has been brought into existence, they have been postulated by force of reason through ignorance. Similarly, whatever other objective existence appears to us as lean or stout, small or big, of the nature of cause or effect, animate or inanimate, know it to be a creation of Maya, known by various names, such as substance, nature, predisposition, the time spirit, and karma. Consciousness alone is true. Consciousness which is pure, absolute, one, having no inside or outside, all perfect, directed towards the self, immutable, and known by the appellation of Bhagavan, that sages call Vasudeva. O Rahugana, one does not attain this through asceticism, nor through rituals, nor by dealing out food and other necessaries, nor by performing one's religious duties, nor through a study of the Vedas, nor through the worship of water, fire, and the sun, except by sprinkling one's body with the dust of the feet of exalted souls. In their assemblies are held discourses on the excellences of the Lord, which shut out talks of worldly pleasures, and which, when listened to every day, concentrate the pure mind of a seeker of liberation on Lord Vasudeva. I was formerly a king, Bharata by name, and having completely got rid of bondage resulting from attachment to that which is seen or heard of, endeavored to propitiate the Lord, but was reborn as a deer through attachment to a deer, and lost my purpose. The memory of past life, awakened in me by the worship of Lord Sri Krishna, did not leave me even in that bestial form, O valiant king. It is therefore that I move about, incognito and unattached, afraid as I am of mixing with the people. Therefore, having completely severed ties of infatuation with the sword of wisdom developed through the blessed company of exalted souls, and attained God consciousness by recounting and listening to the stories of Sri Hari, a man reaches the highest goal of his journey, the Lord himself. Thus ends the 12th discourse, forming part of the dialogue between the Brahmana and King Rahugana in Book 5 of the great and glorious Bhagavata Purana, otherwise known as the Paramahansa Samhita. And I think I'm going to pause there for now. This is going to be about an hour. And I'll put this up for this week. And I'll have to see next week if I'll be able to do this live or whether I will record it in advance again and upload it. All right. Thank you all for watching if you made it this far. Jai Sri Krishna.